A very warm welcome to the video, guys. Today I want to give you my top 3 tips as someone who's done a few Ironman 70.3s in the past, done a lot of cycling, for my top 3 tips for improving your time on the bike with as minimal effort and money invested as possible. Everyone nowadays is always looking for the latest and greatest aerodynamic advancements, the latest or the most efficient, running gear, chain, crankset, aero bars, etc., and training methods and trying to improve. Here's how you can ride a faster time trial without really investing much money at all and without even getting much fitter, to be honest. So let's go through it because it's definitely something which I think can benefit a lot of triathletes out there. These are my top 3 tips. Number 1 is regarding your aero position, and it's just really to do with the gap between your hands and your head. So a lot of people will be in the aero bars and they'll have their hands out and have a pretty decent gap between when they're looking up the road between their hands and their head. If you can close that gap, you're going to create a better funnel of wind around you as you ride through. Because essentially, if you've got an open gap and your chest is exposed to the wind, it's going to act as like a block, right? So if you can have the wind funneling around and create really between your hands and your head, and people will say, it's like the praying mantis position or whatever. You don't have to come up massively high. But if you can head down a bit lower and hands up a bit higher, then you're going to create a much better funnel of wind around you. So that's my number 1 tip. Why does this not cost any money, or why should this be pretty cheap to do? Well, you can go off and, if you just have standard aero bars, which are like straight out, you can go and buy, those aero bars which lift the hands up. And obviously that's probably going to be ideal. What you can also do, and this is literally like what I did, I've done a few 70.3s where I've ridden a 204 bike, a 205 bike, a 209 bike, so 42 to 43 plus kilometers an hour, literally just by taking my aero bars and twisting them up, right? So they're pretty much straight out flat bars, twisting them up so that when I'm in my aero position, and this is purely where I was focusing on, when I'm in my aero position, my hands are a little bit higher. They're not straight out. They're just a little bit elevated. So then I can look up, I can put my head down and tuck down and really try and narrow that gap. And so for the most part of the ride, I don't have this big, chest area that's catching wind. Obviously, there's disadvantages to that in terms of, if you have a straight aero bar and then you twist it up, then the base of that bar is not going to be as aerodynamic as it otherwise would be. However, I think the net benefit of closing the distance between your hands and your head is going to outweigh that little bit of wind catch that's going to be now on your bars that wasn't there before. And if you have monies to spare, then I think obviously you can fully circumnavigate that issue just by buying bars which do allow for that elevated hand position. And again, doesn't need to be you don't need to have your hands like ridiculously high. I just think that if you can just even very small, and remember, always do very small increments at any given time. If you can just elevate your hands slightly and close that gap slightly, that's going to be better than having a bigger gap. That's my number 1 tip. Doesn't have to cost any money whatsoever. Number 2 is saddle comfort. So you might need to invest in a different saddle if your current one is not the most comfortable. But why is this important to riding faster? How does a saddle have any effect on how fast you ride? Well, I would say this is probably just as important. And you don't have to go out and buy a very expensive saddle. You can get the base entry saddle of the same model, and it may not have the most lightest material, but at the end of the day, who cares? Because it's only about comfort, really. Who cares what it looks like? Saddle comfort is so important because if you're doing a time trial, the last thing you want is to be going numb downstairs or to be getting uncomfortable and having pressure going on downstairs. The fastest way that I was able to, pretty much one of the fastest ways I was able to improve my bike time significantly was getting a more comfortable saddle where I didn't have to get up, because every time you get up out of the saddle, you're losing watts. So if you can stay in that aero position for the entire 90 kilometers, 180 kilometers, and very rarely have to get up and try and get blood flow back, that's going to save you a lot of time. So saddle comfort, huge. The next thing is riding to the course. If you have an average power of like 240 watts or 220 watts, a big mistake people make is that they'll try and average that up the hills and down the hills. Often in training, if we're doing on the trainer, we'll try and maintain, 240 watts consistently. What you really want to try and do is ride to the course. So you can have your power goal of like 240 watts average, but don't be trying to sit on 240 watts the whole time. Up hills, you want to be riding at higher power output. Down the hills, you want to be easing off. You essentially want to be maximizing, look at your power as like a reservoir of watts that you have. And it's like, think about it in terms of, okay, I've got 240 watts that I want to average. How fast can I go with those watts? Not can I just hold that the whole time? How fast can I go? When you're going up hills, you're going slower. The slower you're going, the least air resistance you have. So it doesn't necessarily matter if you're out of air position a little bit or whatever. But at the end of the day, when you're going downhill, you've got the most air resistance that you're going to have. That's where ultimate absolute power doesn't matter as much as being aero and tucked. So backing off down the hills and maintaining speed and then pushing over the hills is going to net benefit you a lot more than just otherwise sitting on the same power up and down. And over 180 kilometers, 240 watts consistently on an undulating course will be a lot slower than 240 watts average on an undulating course where you're doing 300 up and 100 down, or 320 up and 120 down, or however it works out. So riding to the course is very important, and ride to speed using your power as like a reservoir that you have to work with. But don't be scared if you're pushing 350 watts and maintaining speed and then backing off and doing 80 watts down the hill and still averaging that power that is in goal, because at the end of the day, the output's the same. It may be a little bit more taxing. This is why training to it's important, but riding to the course can save you a lot of time overall. And you don't necessarily have to be putting out more watts on average. You just have to be really looking for, how can I maintain speed? How can I look for speed on the course? Pushing over the hills, backing off down them is one of the quickest ways to do that. So they're my top 3 tips, guys. Leave a comment. Hopefully that was helpful for some of you. You don't really have to spend any money to do this, and it can be substantial in terms of the effect it has on your overall time.